Hello and welcome to Positively Joy, the podcast on searching in all seasons. And I'm your host, Yvette Walker. Please subscribe wherever you go for podcasts. And now we're on YouTube. I'd like to introduce a special guest today, Jessie Smith, who is a rising senior at the University of Oklahoma's Gaylord College of Journalism and Mass Communication, majoring in online journalism. Jessie, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Dean Walker. I really appreciate it.
You are so welcome. So this show is going to be a little bit different. We've had a lot of different conversations with interesting people. And obviously we are looking to talk about how to activate our joy and searching for joy. This topic is very personal to you and is not necessarily joyous, but is an important topic that is happening today. And we need to, or at least I feel like it's really important that we talk about it. And that's the racial injustice that we have seen going on in this country. But the reason I'm asking you to be on the show today is you wrote an essay in response to the death of George Floyd and basically the last words that he said before his death. And I thought your essay was very powerful and moving, and I want to talk to you about that a little bit today. So,
yes, thank you.
Yeah. If you can talk to us or explain to our listening audience a little bit about what your essay is about and why you decided to write it.
Yes, well, for anyone who doesn't know me, I am indeed a senior. I'm a student reporter for Gaylord News at OU. And the death of George Floyd and the resulting protests have hit me really hard. I think it's hit a lot of Black Americans very hard, and it's caused a lot of deep self-reflection for all of us in a lot of ways. I think the reason this particular horrifying incident really hit me hard is because among George Floyd's last words as he was, asphyxiating and dying, were calling out to his mother. And when I saw that on the video, initially I didn't respond to it. I kind of repressed the emotions of it. But then about a week and a half later, on the same night I was doing a lot of other conversations with people about this subject, I actually found out that his mother, George Floyd's mother, Jessie Floyd, had been dead for 2 years. And that's when I genuinely broke down. I think I cried for about a half hour. I just couldn't stop. The tears wouldn't stop. And the reason it hit me so hard is because I also lost my mother. My mother is dead. I lost my mother 8 years ago now.
I think that when people heard him call out, and as you said, you didn't realize that she'd passed. I think a lot of people thought that she was still alive. And he was just calling out to his mom, which would certainly be expected. But then finding out that she had passed, that takes on an entirely different dimension, wouldn't you say?
Yes, it sure does. Oh, it sure does. Because then whenever we're in trouble or we're feeling some type of pain, and I touch upon this in the piece, we kind of instinctively call out for, our parents. We run to our parents for a source of comfort when we're feeling like we're in any danger. But the fact that she was no longer alive and she had been dead for 2 years really hits differently. And I think in that moment, if you are religious or spiritual, you start wondering, did he see his mom in his last moments? Was he calling for her embrace? Was he being ushered into the next realm by his mother? And that alone, is tragic. But at the same time, there's something very, very universal about that, and very human about that. And that's what triggered the piece for me and made this really hit home for me.
So why, and obviously I certainly know because your mother passed, it would resonate with you. But was there a reason, a particular reason why this man's last words to his mom, who had passed on, spoke so strongly to you?
Well, yes, Because this is one of the things that we have to dig deeper into for this.
Mm-hmm.
But when you think about how many, just the sheer number and the volume of videotaped police brutality that we've seen, especially in the last 5 years, but really in the last 10 to 20 years, especially, you don't really see something like this necessarily because the context is so different. This is a very slow and brutal process, him dying over the however many minutes it was. It's not instantaneous, and that's what made it really brutal for me. It hit me extremely hard, and it made me remember, quite honestly, when my own mother, when she was dying 8 years ago, she also said the same thing. She also cried out for her mother as well as she was dying.
Wow.
And yes, and so it made me realize that very likely when I die, just like George Floyd and just like my mother, Patricia Smith, I will also call for my mom. And she's not here anymore. And so I think it was that reality of, the horror of that moment, but also the desire for the embrace of his mom in his last moments that really, really caused this essay to come out of me. And when I say it was a bleeding process to write it, it really was. It took me 3 days. It was I had to edit it constantly. I was in a really scratchy mood for those 3 days. But this is an essay, Like a Mother's Child, The Memory of George Floyd is the name of the essay, is what resulted.
Well, I'd love to be able to share an excerpt with the listeners. Would you mind reading your favorite passage?
Yes, absolutely. I will be happy to. Let me just scroll down to it. Here we go. So this is going to go into the contextual understanding of why the videotaping of George Floyd's death probably triggered so many people differently,
Mm-hmm.
and why the protests are occurring. It's going to delve into something that's very fitting for this podcast. It's a bit lengthy, but hopefully I can get through it. If there is but one person that both white and black America are willing to hold up as a martyr, it is Jesus of Nazareth, the poor but charismatic Jewish itinerant speaker who traveled around a divided Middle Eastern nation 2 millennia ago, calling for a better world and curing the sick without requesting payment. Ministers like Pat Robertson and William Barber, for example, have both claimed to revere him. Their main source of disagreement is because they see two completely different Jesuses. It was the late black theologian James Cone who most forcefully made the connection between the crucifixion of Jesus and the extrajudicial killings of black Americans. This comparison often made contemporary white theologians uncomfortable, but Cone never ran from these philosophical confrontations. His book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, best encapsulates this perspective, and I could not help but think of Cone's theology as I wept for George Floyd and his late mother. The physical, emotional, and psychological pain of a crucifixion is unfathomable. We've tried to come up with a word that quantifies it: excruciating. Crucifixion was conceived as an utterly dehumanizing, torturously brutal form of capital punishment, reserved for the absolute worst perpetrators of crimes against the Roman state. Fastened either by rope or by nails, victims were hung naked to wooden beams and put on display for the public to watch as they died, slowly and gruesomely, of asphyxiation. Today, the sheer terror of lynchings upon the black population of this country is still not adequately represented in the history books. An unjust practice heavily concentrated in the South, lynchings of black Americans became commonplace during the 100 years after the Civil War, as formerly enslaved people tried to assert their truth in society. Mobs of white people, everyday citizens, would drag black people into the public square, hang them by their necks on trees, and then set fire to their bodies as they struggled and swung. It made no difference if the black American was guilty of a crime. They usually weren't, but the laws were a sham anyway. These white mobs are full of local doctors, bankers, and businessmen who treated the lynchings as some type of celebratory spectacle. It would be inaccurate to say that law enforcement looked the other way, because police officers show up as willful participants and organizers in some of the most gruesome lynchings we have on record. No one was ever held accountable. The bulwark of white supremacy refused to give way to justice. Black people had to be put in their place, quote unquote. The trauma that these public lynchings inflicted on the psyche of Black America remains. They were a tool of intimidation, a sadistic form of mind control, a sign that you were subhuman and that your life didn't matter. If you dared to resist, to live your own dignity and humanity, you would suffer the same fate. You would be murdered for sport. You would lose everything. This is what will happen to you, they say. This is what awaits you. Humiliation, suffering, and death. And there's nothing you can do about it. You're not a slave anymore, but you might as well be, huh? You know you're not a slave anymore, but you don't want to die, do you?
Wow. Um, when you the last piece of that sounded like advice that perhaps a family member might give a younger family member. A mother might give a son. You know, you're not a
Right.
slave, but you don't want to die, so don't talk back to the police or shut up or whatever.
Yes.
Um, do you recall any conversations like that you had, with your family?
Yes. Uh-huh. Absolutely.
And
In
we probably
fact,
we probably should say that you are African American male.
oh yes, yes, we should say that. Yes, I am an African American male. I'm also, I just turned 28. So, um, but yes, I did have a number of conversations like that with my mother. In fact, the piece also delves into a situation where when I was walking home one night, I was stopped by a police officer. I think it was 2 a.m. in the morning, between 2 a.m. 2:30 in the morning. After I was leaving my job as a manager at a fast food restaurant, I was stopped by a police officer in a very dark part of Norman, with no one else around me and no one else on the street, which was quite honestly very terrifying for me. But it was actually my mom's voice and my mom's advice and memories of that advice that actually got me through that situation. And
Okay.
I write about that in the piece.
Mm. You talk about the crucifixion, the cross, and comparing it to the lynching tree. And it made me wonder as I was reading the piece and then again listening to you, um, do you think that the black community, and again, I'm going to speak in generalities because obviously no community is monolithic, but a large part of the black community is Christian and believes in Jesus, and certainly a large part of the black community that was discriminated against clung um, to their spirituality, their faith, their religion to get through it. And I wonder, as I'm listening to you and again reading the piece, is it because Jesus suffered as a human that you think a suffering community could relate or could respect as much as they did?
Yes, absolutely. This is in fact the whole crux of the Cross and the Lynching Tree book, is that the connection is so very obvious. It goes without saying. Um, I mean, look at all the parallels. The cross being pieces of wood, people being hung on a cross, usually for something like what they would call treason, or just trying to call out the authorities. Basically, at that point, Jesus himself in the gospel narrative was not guilty of any actual crime. He was basically, framed for murder. Um, and then you make these connections with the lynching tree and what that means in these towns and in these public squares, and you realize that the Christian church as it existed in America, and I mean this honestly as the white Christian church, not the black Christian church, but the white Christian church, because of various other institutional problems like the obvious vestige of white supremacy, and even like the slave master mentality, shall we say, was still perpetrating this type of violence, the same type of violence that those who killed Jesus are perpetrating upon the black community. And it's a very obvious, again, it's such an obvious parallel that you would probably wonder why it doesn't get brought up all the time. And it does get brought up all the time in the black community, but I don't think the shall we say, the white evangelical church, shall we say, doesn't quite make this connection, and frankly doesn't want to, at least not until recently. So,
as you know, watching a lot of the coverage, and looking on and social media, I'm seeing a lot of emotions, a lot of sadness, and a lot of anger. And on this show, we talk about how can we find joy in the midst of different seasons. And my question to you is, how can people find joy in the midst of the injustice that we're witnessing now? And is it through faith?
yes, I would certainly say so. But it kind of depends on one's definition of joy. But I will also expand it with some other things that I have learned from not only the writings of like James Cone, but also from the wisdom of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu,
Mm-hmm.
and even the Dalai Lama. They have this beautiful book that I can't recommend enough called The Book of Joy, which is basically days worth of interviews with the Dalai Lama and with Archbishop Desmond Tutu about their friendship, about their lives, and about their how they survive and how they cope with the problems of the world that they see as moral leaders. And they have advice that they want to give out. It's called the 8 Pillars of Joy. I believe the 8 pillars are perspective and humility, humor and acceptance, forgiveness and gratitude, and compassion and generosity, all of which go into how we filter joy and how we experience joy on this earth, despite massive injustice, despite horrible pain, despite any of the other hang-ups and grievances we might have. And so my advice myself, piggybacking off of these guys, would be to, one, continue to voice yourself and make your reality known, make your experiences known, be a witness. This can serve as your moment of testimony. So don't run away from it. Don't stifle yourself just to make someone else comfortable. It's time for it. This is a watershed moment. And so I think that my advice for Black Americans would be to continue to bear witness, continue to offer up your testimony, continue to live your truth, but also at the same time also stress the possibility of forgiveness and acceptance. And this is also advice for white Americans or those who are not Black. Acceptance and perspective and humility. And so you must accept that, what has happened has happened. Just like, any victim would have to also accept that what has happened to them has happened, and they have to live through that and, work through those emotions and those grievances. But also, whoever the perpetrator is, or in this case, not necessarily a perpetrator, but simply a community that through various systemic means has perpetuated an oppression, complicitly or not, implicitly or not, of another community for centuries in various ways. And so you have to accept that has happened. You have to be humble enough to admit that, even if I didn't have anything to do with it, this has happened. These different groups of people that are represented between me and my Black friend, for example, we're living through these decades and decades of what has come before us. And we have to be humble enough to accept that, this is something that happened, and the only way to account for it is to ask for a certain amount of forgiveness. And I don't think, honestly, that this conversation has been had enough over the last many decades, because quite honestly, many white Americans just don't want to have that conversation. They would prefer to not feel so uncomfortable. But the reality is, as a Black American, we experience discomfort on multiple levels every day in every aspect of society. And I think that now is the time that white America, and I use that term very broadly, has to accept, humble themselves, and ask for a certain level of forgiveness so that we can move forward, and that we can live with compassion for one another and with generosity towards one another, and finally achieve true justice for both Black and white America.
Wise words. Thank you so much. So, where can we find your essay? Where can people go online to find it?
Right now, it's currently on Medium, the platform Medium. It's called Like a Motherless Child, The Memory of George Floyd. There's a lot of different meanings in the title. It's based off of the main part of the title is based off of a very famous Negro spiritual. And then the subtitle, The Memory of George Floyd, carries a certain type of double or triple meaning, really, when you really dig deeper into the essay. But yes, it's currently on Medium. I will soon be publishing it as well on my OU Create blog, so you'll probably be able to find it there if you can't find it on Medium for whatever reason, if it's hid behind a paywall. But it won't be on a paywall on OU Create, and I'll be putting that up here within the week as well. Okay,
thank you. So, you're about to be a senior. What's next for you?
Well, in a couple of months, I will be leaving to go to D.C. To do reporting for Gaylord News. And I'll be there for a few months, basically covering the election and in anything that relates to, D.C. politics and how it relates back to the state of Oklahoma. After that, I have capstones, and then after that, I'm going to self-examine and see what my options are, and go with whatever God wills me to go, whatever I think will be the best place for my voice.
Excellent. What's your dream job?
Honestly, my dream job would be it's funny, it's kind of silly, but there's two really. One would be to be an investigative journalist, and just be able to, go around America and, uncover some of the worst injustices and shine a light upon them, and also shine a light on possible solutions. And then, my secondary dream job would probably be host some type of talk show where we can openly discuss history and culture and film and music and all types of topics like that.
Not silly topics at all. those are really great goals. And anyone listening out there, get a hold of this young man. He is going to be quite the go-getter. So, Jessie, thank you so much for speaking to us today and sharing your essay. Everyone, please look to medium.com for Like a Motherless Child. And again, we really appreciate you being here. And I know this was very personal to you and sometimes difficult to talk about. So we appreciate it.
Yes, but difficult conversations are the only ones worth having.
Amen. Amen. Yes. Yes. All right. Well, to our listeners, thank you again for listening. This has been Positively Joy. And as always, farewell for now.